Hello, my name is Stacy Moore, and I would like to discuss the role of regional organizations in global peacekeeping, utilizing the example of ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States. Currently, the United Nations has 16 active missions around the globe. 55 to 62% of these will see success, according to Fortna. However, this success, measured in simply a cessation of fighting, does not come without a cost. The United Nations spends tens of billions of dollars every year in peacekeeping operations, and they are increasingly relying on regional organizations to help with peacekeeping operations and to stage interventions on their own when the United Nations seems unable to act quickly enough. In fact, regional groups are recognized as being able to launch missions much more quickly and launch missions with greater cultural relevancy than the UN. However, they often lack the resources needed to maintain peacekeeping operations for any length of time. ECOWAS is a particularly good example of a well-developed regional organization. They started as a group that promotes economic stability in the West African region in 1975 with 16 member states. Their first mission was to conduct a peacekeeping operation in Liberia. The mission was seen as largely successful. However, the forces that deployed there were not without being criticized. They were seen to at times have corrupt practices, and the Francophone and Anglophone states were seen as choosing sides between various rebel groups who shared their interests. The mission was seen as successful, even though after 14 years they did have to turn the mission over to the United Nations because they lacked logistics resources and some of the civilian development expertise that the UN could provide for those missions. Since that time, ECOWAS has staged interventions in other nations such as Sierra Leone and the Ivory Coast, and has developed additional protocols to guide them in their interventions in their member states. Particularly recently, they have moved their protocols towards human rights and good governance practices. This provides them with a very well-developed set of criteria for interventions with the member states, and allows them to act without UN or AU mandate in their region. The one issue is that many of the member states are poorly developed themselves and therefore lack resources to contribute to these larger missions that are required quite often. And the UN has shown an interest in partnering with such regional organizations like ECOWAS, and to that end has developed a series of documents that they've been releasing since 1999 to refine their best practices in peacekeeping. Particularly the New Horizons in Peacekeeping document that was released in 2009 emphasizes the need to create an interoperability between regional organizations and the UN in order for peacekeeping operations to be seamless and more efficient. That being said, there are regional organizations in Africa that have shown very good interoperability with the United Nations, or at least an ability for them to organize missions with the United Nations. And the African Union is one such organization. The African Union replaced the OAU in 2001. And it is ostensibly an intermediary between the United Nations and the regional organizations on the African continent. It's conducted operations in Somalia, which are seen as extraordinarily successful, and that is a purely AU mission, and also a hybrid mission in Darfur with the UN. The AU originally entered Darfur to stop ethnic cleansing and try to bargain a ceasefire between rebel groups there and the regime in Khartoum. However, the AU's forces came under fire, and they were unable to sustain or resource their mission appropriately, and therefore it was handed over to the UN, and it continues today with the UN funding it at a cost of $1.3 billion for between July 2013 and June 2014. However, the AU lacks a strong framework for its interaction with its regional partners. They have made great steps in trying to create an African standby force, whereby each country or regional group would provide a battalion of soldiers to act as the standby force. However, it has not in place the policy framework like the ECOWAS group has to clearly define when it will create interventions and to create that policy framework that actually allows it to mandate and or direct regional groups in their interventions within their own regions. So that shows us that there are many options for peacekeeping, particularly on the African continent. However, there are some like Deal who would argue that the UN is really the only organizing body for peacekeeping. The UN was created with the original mandate to promote peace around the globe and is often seen as the only party that could remain truly neutral in some of these peacekeeping operations. Others, like Russett and Taylor, argue that regional organizations or even single powerful nations within a region are best postured to conduct peacekeeping operations, whether they do so on their own or with the coordination of the United Nations. Regional groups and or single nations often share cultural religious heritage with the nation in which they are intending to intervene, which gives them the ability to interact more favorably with the populace and potentially create a more lasting peace. That being said, though, Laskos and Bio both argue that any peacekeeping force that fails to understand the full political situation in whatever country they're intervening in is bound to fail, with Bio making the astute observation that in Africa in particular, the political environment is such that it is organized as a marketplace where power is bought and sold, and peacekeepers may unintentionally tip the balance towards unsavory characters in such a political environment. So that leaves us with many problems to peacekeeping and potentially few solutions. However complex and politically charged the solutions are, there are ways to make the peacekeeping process more efficient. First, the UN must make the Security Council more representative of the global community and the power structures that exist now, as opposed to those that happened immediately after World War II or during the Cold War. Currently, the permanent five on the Security Council are not representative of the global South. China is the only Asian nation, with potentially the exception of Russia, which tends to fall more into the European milieu. This causes a gap in representation for newly emerging nations like India and Brazil, and a complete dearth of representation with veto power from the global South, where most of these interventions are likely to occur. Additionally, mandates for peacekeeping cannot be allowed to be held up within the Security Council. They must be fast-tracked through the process, particularly when nations are already violating treaties that establish a legal basis for an intervention. There must be a formal process within the UN as well for these regional organizations to gain authorizations for missions and to request mission support when they know that they will face a shortfall when they go to sustain a peacekeeping mission. The UN should build on its recommendations in its New Horizons report, and instead of simply waiting for an intervention mission to happen and assisting with the planning in the very beginning stages, they should begin contingency planning with regional organizations now. Such contingency planning is common throughout militaries around the world and would build military capacity and provide nations with the seeds of plans so that they would be ready when peacekeeping interventions were needed. The UN should also attempt to get member nations to commit troops as a standby force for UN peacekeeping operations. While very few nations would be willing to commit troops to be placed under UN command and control strictly on a standby basis, they may be more willing to align forces with UN peacekeeping missions to be on a 72 to 96 hour deployment callback. That would allow the UN to have a ready pool of forces without going to ask individual member nations for contributions. but also avoid the problem of those nations losing the ability to utilize the troops when there was no peacekeeping mission to be deployed for. Additionally, the UN could create equipment sets for peacekeeping missions to be pre-staged around the world. These mission sets of equipment could be utilized by troops from any nation, thus solving some of the resourcing and interoperability problems that are inherent in peacekeeping operations. In addition to these equipment sets and soldiers that would be on standby, it's also imperative that the UN provide a standby civilian force that would be able to deploy, in addition to the soldiers and military equipment, to begin the process of rebuilding post-conflict societies as soon as ceasefire was reached and it was safe to do so. If the UN fails to create a more coherent process for regional organizations to provide peacekeeping interventions, they will, in the long run, fail to be able to leverage their vast resources and expertise to create the most effective and cost-efficient peacekeeping operations possible, which is not something that the global community can afford at this time. Thank you.